In the summer of 1987, Washington, D.C. buzzed with the usual rhythm of government life. White stone buildings, stacks of paperwork, the hum of typewriters echoing through secure hallways. For most, it was a season of ordinary bureaucratic routines. But for one young CIA codebreaker, the corridors of secrecy were far more dangerous than they appeared. At just 24 years old, she vanished from her assignment without a trace, leaving behind an office chair that still spun slightly when colleagues discovered her absence. Her disappearance sent whispers rippling through the agency's tightly controlled walls. To some, it was unthinkable, an employee slipping away unnoticed from one of the most secure intelligence communities in the world. To others, the silence was expected, even calculated. In a place where invisible wars were fought through paper trails and intercepted signals, people could disappear as easily as files pulled from a drawer. Official statements were sparse, painting her absence as either voluntary or irrelevant, a narrative designed to soothe rather than to clarify. Yet inside the secure rooms, suspicions swelled. Had she defected to a foreign power? Had she uncovered something forbidden within the coded stream she worked so tirelessly to untangle? The ordinary life of a desk-bound analyst clashed violently with rumors of double agents, hidden operations, and betrayal from within. And then there was the file, locked away, stamped, and forgotten in a sea of classified material. For years it gathered dust, dismissed as routine intelligence debris. But buried within its pages lay something extraordinary, a crudely drawn map of safe houses scattered across American soil. It was an artifact that raised more questions than it answered. Who drew it? Why was it concealed? And most haunting of all, how did it connect to the young woman who had simply vanished? Into the shadows of 1987? That unanswered question, frozen in time, would not resurface until decades later, when the world had changed and the file was forced back into the light. And with it, the case of the missing codebreaker was reopened in ways no one expected. Washington, D.C., 1987. The city was both a symbol of order and a labyrinth of secrets. Suited men hurried down marble steps carrying leather briefcases, while in dimly lit offices, analysts stared at glowing green monitors, decoding streams of intercepted transmissions. It was a world where the ordinary routine of paperwork concealed the extraordinary stakes of a Cold War that was far from over. Behind the polished facades of government buildings, clandestine operations threaded through the city like invisible wires, binding the capital to global conflicts thousands of miles away. Within this environment worked a young CIA codebreaker, just 24 years old. She was sharp, meticulous, and fluent in patterns others overlooked. Colleagues later described her as brilliant yet modest, her desk often piled with coded fragments that she translated into meaningful intelligence reports. But brilliance carried little weight in a male-dominated agency that valued hierarchy over innovation. She was often underestimated, viewed as the eager junior whose work was essential, but whose voice was rarely heard in senior briefings. That contrast, her quiet mastery of cryptography versus the institution's dismissal of her potential, would become haunting in retrospect. Her life outside the agency offered a different picture. To family and friends, she was simply a young woman with a contagious laugh, a fondness for late-night walks along the Potomac, and a habit of carrying notebooks filled with cryptic doodles and numbers. She balanced ordinary pleasures with the hidden burdens of her classified work, yet she rarely spoke about her job, reminding her loved ones that certain things just couldn't be discussed. In that silence, suspicion would later take root. When she vanished one evening from her secure assignment, the official narrative was swift and clinical. Internal reports suggested she might have walked away voluntarily, overwhelmed by stress or perhaps drawn into personal entanglements. Her personnel file was closed with startling speed, its pages stamped and locked into classified archives. To the agency, it was a footnote. To her family, it was an erasure. They rejected the notion that she had abandoned her life willingly. Their daughter, they insisted, was not the type to run, especially without a word. This divergence between institutional record and lived truth created a fracture that has never fully healed. Her colleagues quietly whispered that the sudden classification of her files was unusual, especially given her relatively junior status. Why would documents linked to a young analyst be treated as though they threatened national security? Why was the absence of one woman, barely noticed in the wider machinery of the Cold War, buried so quickly under layers of secrecy? These were the questions that lingered in her family's kitchen, in late-night conversations with former coworkers, and in the minds of journalists who stumbled across her name years later. The contrast was stark. To the government, she was a closed case. To those who knew her, she was a victim of something hidden, something larger than a personal choice. If the agency truly had nothing to hide, why did her story vanish into locked cabinets the moment she disappeared? That silence would grow louder with time, until nearly 2 decades later, when a single declassified file would pull her name and her mystery back into the light. It was the spring of 2006 when a lawyer in Virginia, working on a broad Freedom of Information Act request, received a package of documents from the CIA. Most of it was predictable. Blurred lines of black ink, redactions that swallowed entire paragraphs, and pages so sanitized, they seemed almost blank. For weeks, the stack looked no different than thousands of other FOIA releases, mundane traces of bureaucratic history, stripped of meaning by the government's heavy hand. But buried in the middle of the file was something that didn't fit. It was a single sheet of yellowing paper, crudely drawn in pen, marked with simple shapes and notations. At first glance, it looked like a child's sketch, rough and almost careless. But the heading at the top, Safe Locations, suggested something far more deliberate. The sheet contained an outline of Washington streets, dots for houses, and arrows that linked one location to another. Some addresses were scribbled beside them. Some were only marked with letters, as if coded for those who already knew their meaning. Investigators and journalists who later reviewed the file were stunned. Safe houses were not a term tossed lightly in intelligence circles. They were the quiet skeletons of espionage, places used for meetings, shelter, or surveillance. To find a hand-drawn map tucked inside an unrelated release was more than curious. It was a fracture in the wall of secrecy. The object's power lay in its contrast. On one side, thousands of sterile documents scrubbed of detail. On the other, this fragile sketch alive with implication. Why was it there? Who had drawn it, and why had it been hidden in a file connected to a vanished codebreaker from 1987? Her family, who had spent nearly 2 decades demanding answers, were jolted when the map surfaced. To them, it wasn't random. They recalled her notebooks, the cryptic scribbles she carried in her bag, the numbers she doodled when her mind wandered. The handwriting wasn't hers, at least not clearly, but the timing was too precise, the association too uncanny. Reporters pounced, publishing grainy scans of the map online. Forums lit up with speculation. Was it the work of a rogue agent? A double agent mapping CIA safe houses for a foreign power? Or was it her discovery, something she had stumbled across before she vanished? Each theory deepened the mystery, forcing even the most skeptical readers to reconsider the official story that she had simply walked away. The CIA's response only fueled suspicion. Officials refused to comment on the map's origins, dismissing it as miscellaneous material caught in the release process. But if that were true, why had it remained hidden for nearly 20 years? Why did its existence align so neatly with the last year she was seen alive? The paper, ordinary and fragile, suddenly became the most important clue in a case long buried under silence. It shifted the story from personal tragedy to geopolitical intrigue, forcing investigators to treat her disappearance not as an isolated choice, but as part of a wider puzzle. The map reopened the case in the public eye, not because it solved the mystery, but because it sharpened the questions. Who drew those lines? Why were those locations chosen? And most pressing of all, what had the young codebreaker uncovered that made her vanish before the sketch ever saw the light of day? The answers, investigators would soon find, lay not only in the map itself but in the memories of those who once worked beside her, and in the shadows of operations the agency had never intended to expose. The crude safehouse map was no longer a curiosity, it was a spark. By summer 2006, investigative journalists had seized on it, piecing together a story that the CIA had long sought to bury. What began as a minor note in a redacted file quickly spiraled into a full-scale re-examination of a disappearance almost 2 decades old. In the shadows of post-9/11 America, when transparency battles raged against institutional secrecy, the timing felt inevitable. The Cold War was long over, but the ghosts it left behind refused to rest. The first to dig deeper were veteran intelligence reporters, many of whom had spent their careers chasing the shifting narratives of government denials. They ached out to the Codebreaker's surviving relatives, her parents now older, her younger brother, a father himself. Their home still held photographs of her smiling beside the Potomac, her eyes bright with ambition. The family, worn down by years of unanswered letters and unanswered calls, recognized the map as validation. It wasn't proof, but it was evidence that her case had never been as simple as "she walked away." Former colleagues, coaxed into interviews, added new layers. One supervisor described her as a prodigy with ciphers, someone who solved complex encryption puzzles in hours where others took days. Yet official reports painted a different picture: an unstable employee, prone to emotional difficulties and overwork. The contrast was glaring: admiration in private, dismissal in the record. Why would the agency need to cast her as fragile unless there was something to hide? Neighbors, too, offered contradictions. A woman living in the same apartment complex remembered unusual late-night visitors in the months before the disappearance, men in dark suits who never stayed long, who left as quietly as they arrived. Another recalled seeing her pacing the parking lot, notebook in hand, jotting symbols under the streetlights. None of this matched the official timeline that claimed she simply vanished without signs of duress. The map itself became a focal point. Investigators traced several of the addresses marked on it. Some led to innocuous residences, but others? They corresponded to locations later identified in Cold War archives as suspected safe houses used by Eastern Bloc intelligence services. The possibility was chilling. Had the young Codebreaker uncovered a clandestine network operating on U.S. soil? Or worse, had she been working with them? The trail led overseas. Journalists followed connections into declassified files in Berlin, Warsaw, and Prague. In Stern European archives, the name of a young American woman appeared in fragments, sometimes only as initials, sometimes buried in surveillance notes. In one Polish file, a reference was made to the girl with codes, though the description stopped short of identifying her directly. Still, the implication was clear: she had become a person of interest not only to her own government but also to its enemies. Ex-intelligence officers interviewed on background were divided. Some believed she had been abducted, a pawn stolen in the silent chess match of espionage. Others suspected recruitment, that she had willingly crossed over after realizing what the CIA was hiding from her. The most cynical suggested silencing, that she had stumbled too close to a forbidden truth and was erased by the very agency sworn to protect her. Each theory carried weight, but none explained why a hand-drawn map remained buried for nearly 20 years. The deeper the investigation went, the more contradictions surfaced. An official memo from 1987, finally obtained through persistence, placed her at work on the very day her family claimed she had been missing for hours. A witness statement taken by local police mentioned an agency vehicle parked near her apartment complex the night she disappeared. Yet the CIA denied ever being involved with the case. Every layer pulled back revealed another inconsistency, another gap between what people remembered and what the records claimed. And through it all, the map loomed. Handwriting experts suggested it was drawn in haste, possibly by someone trained in field work, but not in cartography. The arrows, the cryptic notations, the circles around certain addresses, each detail pointed to intent, not accident. If she had seen this map, or if she had drawn it herself, it meant she had been closer to something dangerous than anyone had realized. By late 2006, the story had grown too large to ignore. News outlets debated her fate in primetime specials. Families of Cold War defectors came forward claiming their relatives had whispered about an American Gurus, who had surfaced briefly in Eastern Europe before vanishing again. Online forums obsessed over every redacted line, speculating whether she had been a hero uncovering rogue operations or a casualty of divided loyalties. Each revelation raised the stakes. The contrast between the Cold War era's paranoia and the modern demand for transparency was impossible to ignore. In the late 1980s, her disappearance was a rumor whispered in hallways. In 2006, it was a public reckoning. Had the CIA lost one of its own to a foreign adversary? Had it covered up a breach on American soil? Or had it deliberately silenced a young woman who had discovered truths too dangerous to reveal? The map did not answer these questions outright, but it reframed them, dragging the past into the present with sharp clarity. No longer was her case dismissed as a personal choice or youthful instability. It had become a matter of espionage, betrayal, and power. The investigation was no longer about whether she vanished by accident or design. It was about uncovering who stood to gain from her disappearance. And the next step would bring investigators closer to the truth than anyone had dared to imagine, as handwriting analysis and long-buried testimonies pointed directly toward someone shockingly close to her world. The investigation reaches its turning point when the map, once dismissed as a crude doodle, is examined by a group of retired intelligence veterans. Their eyes, trained in tradecraft and forgery detection, immediately catch what others missed: the handwriting. It isn't random, nor the mark of an anonymous clerk. The sharp, angular strokes match notes from internal CIA memos of the late 1980s, memos linked to a little-known unit tasked with overseeing domestic security logistics. For the first time, the decades-old mystery takes on a tangible edge. The map isn't just a curiosity. It is a brochure. Breadcrumb trail, one that points not to foreign safe houses abroad, but to a hidden lattice of domestic operations, properties scattered quietly across U.S. soil. The revelation is electric. Former operatives whisper that these houses were never meant to be documented. They functioned outside traditional oversight, designed for unofficial purposes. Off-the-books interrogations, discreet rendezvous with defectors, even storage of sensitive materials away from prying bureaucratic eyes. If the girl had drawn attention to them in 1987, she would have placed herself in direct opposition to powerful forces intent on secrecy. The confrontation intensifies when analysts compare surviving fragments of her journals, recovered years earlier from her apartment. In the margins of her cryptic notes, she had scrawled phrases that now echo with chilling clarity. They watch their own, not foreign, domestic, and trust no one in-house. What once seemed like paranoia now reads as evidence of what she had stumbled upon: a shadow network hidden in plain sight. As these pieces surface, the battle lines sharpen. Families of the vanished press harder for accountability, while journalists demand that Congress reopen oversight hearings. The CIA, cornered, issues flat denials, insisting the girl's disappearance remains an unresolved personnel matter. Yet every denial only deepens suspicion. Then comes the blow that crystallizes betrayal. A handwriting analyst, formerly employed by the FBI, confirms with 95% certainty that the map was drawn by one of the girl's direct supervisors. That man, long retired and living quietly in Virginia, is confronted in an interview. His responses wobble between forgetfulness and deflection, but one line escapes him like a crack in the facade: "She never should have seen that file." The implication is devastating. She hadn't just uncovered the existence of domestic safe houses. She had read something she was never meant to read, and by drawing attention to it, whether in notes or to colleagues, she had made herself dangerous. The discovery reframes everything: her brilliance as a codebreaker, her erratic final months, the late-night visitors reported by neighbors. None of it was random. She had been piecing together something buried deep within the institution she served, and those who should have protected her instead viewed her as a liability. But the confrontation does not yield closure. Instead, it opens a deeper wound. If she was silenced to preserve secrets, what was her ultimate fate? Was she hidden away in one of the very safe houses she identified? Was she exfiltrated forcibly or willingly into another identity? Or was her disappearance the final step in a cover-up that went far beyond a missing girl? The truth emerges not as a single revelation, but as a clash between eras: the secrecy of the Cold War against the accountability demanded in the post-9/11 world. In that collision, the girl's story becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a symbol of what happens when truth threatens power. The storm of revelations forces the walls of secrecy to crack. Congressional hearings summon former supervisors, analysts, and even those who once dismissed the girl's brilliance as paranoia. A tense back and forth plays out on live television. Senators push for clarity, while witnesses dodge, citing national security. The public watches, stunned, as declassified records confirm the existence of unauthorized safe houses on U.S. soil, a truth once unthinkable. Media pressure amplifies the story. Journalists frame her as both victim and whistleblower, a young codebreaker who stumbled too close to the fault line of power. Relatives, holding faded photographs, testify that her life was never meant to be a pawn in intelligence games. Each headline spreads her legacy further, shaping her into a symbol of Cold War-era betrayal meeting post-9/11 calls for accountability. Yet justice is fractured. The exposure brings institutional reform, tightened oversight, dismantled networks, promises of transparency, but none of it restores the missing girl. Her voice remains absent, her body unrecovered, her fate unresolved. For every revelation, another silence lingers. In the end, she becomes a haunting reminder of the fragility of democratic oversight. Hidden maps become metaphors, one drawn in secrecy to hide power, another etched into public record to demand truth. The world now knows pieces of her story, but never its final chapter. In the years following the revelations, the Codebreaker's disappearance became more than a cold case. It became a symbol. Her story threaded its way into congressional debates, watchdog reports, and classroom discussions within intelligence academies. The map, once locked away in a classified archive, was reproduced in newspapers, declassified hearings, and even textbooks, transformed into both a cautionary artifact and a tribute to the risks carried by those who work in silence. For ordinary citizens, the case served as a jarring reminder that the machinery of government, often unseen, unquestioned, could conceal truths as easily as it protected them. The FOIA release of 2006 did not only expose a safe-house network, it peeled back a layer of secrecy that had shaped the very fabric of the Cold War era. Within the intelligence community, her name carried a different weight. To the veterans who remembered her as a brilliant young cryptanalyst, she was not simply a missing person, but a colleague silenced at the height of her talent. Training seminars quietly referenced her case, warning new recruits of the thin line between discovery and danger, between patriotism and peril. Her story circulated like an open secret, never fully acknowledged, yet never allowed to vanish. Still, the haunting absence remained. No body was ever recovered. No definitive account surfaced of whether she was silenced, exiled, or simply erased. Families of the disappeared know too well that closure is a luxury. Instead, they inherit questions that echo across decades. Yet in an unintended way, her legacy reshaped the system. Safeguards were strengthened, oversight committees demanded broader access, and the notion of unchecked clandestine operations was debated more vigorously than before. Her silence, paradoxically, gave voice to reforms that might one day protect others. The epilogue of her life is not written in stone, but in vigilance, in the idea that secrecy must always be balanced by accountability. The map she left behind, hand-drawn in an era of shadows, now sits in archives as a permanent reminder. Courage can be buried, but it cannot be erased. And as researchers, historians, and young codebreakers revisit her case, one lingering question refuses to fade. How many other maps remain hidden, waiting for the day someone dares to unseal them?